Welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. We are excited you have decided to join us today. We're going to be looking at a psalm, Psalm 121 to be exact. And we're going to take a look at how God watches over us, protects us, and guides us along this journey of life, especially when we need Him most. So thank you for being here today. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you could really use some help? A helping hand, someone there to just extend some grace to you and help you? I've been there, and I'm sure you've been there too. I came across a story that was published many, many years ago in a devotional entitled Bits and Pieces by William Schultz. He tells a story of his daughter, who was about 3 years old at the time, and her name was Lori. And he said it was about bedtime for her, and he was downstairs, and she was upstairs, and he heard her voice calling from upstairs, saying, "Daddy, can you please come help me get undressed?" And Schultz, not wanting to make the journey up the stairs, responded and said, "Honey, I know you know how to get undressed by yourself. You don't need my help." And her little voice came once again from upstairs and said, "Yeah, but sometimes we need help even though we know how to do things by ourselves." And the truth is, isn't that us sometimes? Aren't we like that? Even though we might know how to do things by ourselves, sometimes we want or we even need help. I ran across another story a little while back. A news story that ran about a man who was doing some work on an ATM at a Bank of America in Corpus Christi, Texas. He'd been scheduled to do this work, so he was there working on this ATM machine, and somehow he had gotten stuck. He had gotten stuck inside the room that houses the ATM machines. And as I'm sure you can imagine, those rooms, those places have some pretty high security. They are very difficult to break into because of the amount of cash that is held within there. So the ATM door was closed and he'd gotten shut in, and he had left his cell phone in the service truck. So there was no way for him to get out. And he was stuck there. He would have been stuck there until the next day when the bank opened. But he decided to get creative. He knew he needed some help. And so as people drove up and came up to the ATM to do their business, deposit checks, cash, withdraw something, he began to write these little notes on their receipts. And so as they would do their business and they would get their receipts, they would receive a note saying that he needed help. Well, understandably, a number of the people just kind of wrote it off as a prank. They didn't think it was a big deal. They thought someone was just trying to be funny. But finally, someone decided to take it seriously, and that individual called the police. And they told them what had happened. They said, "Listen, we've received this note out of our ATM machine at Bank of America, and we think there is an issue. We think there might be somebody stuck inside this room." And so the police came down to the bank, and they had to break down the door, but they did just that, and they saved the man from having to be there for a long time. The news stations interviewed one of the senior police officers, and he said, sure enough, we could hear this small voice calling out from inside the ATM machine. And so we went in there, and we got him out. Sometimes we need help. Sometimes our own ability just isn't quite enough to get us out of a sticky situation, out of a tough moment. I remember a few years ago, I worked for the Central California Conference of Seventh-day Adventists in a job that I loved. Every year, summertime would roll around, and in July, the Central California Conference puts on a camp meeting in SoCal, California, and which is held near Santa Cruz, California, up there by the beach. It's a beautiful place, and you should go or at least tune in online if you ever get the chance. Well, I was there, and I was working in the main auditorium with part of the tech team. I was a stage manager, and I would help organize certain things and get people on and off the stage. And it was a good time. But that year, they had made a decision that at the very end of each program, for the broadcast audience watching on TV or watching online, they would do this short 30-second spot, just teasing the events and the things that were coming for the next day for the broadcast audience. So someone would sit on a chair, look directly into a camera, and say, "Thank you for joining us here this evening. We've got this speaker tomorrow night, a concert this weekend. Come back tomorrow." And on one of the nights, I was chosen to do the spot. And I was excited. I thought, hey, this is a great opportunity. A 30-second spot, I'll get to look at the camera. You know, it'll be a good time. So my night rolled around, and there I was. I had written this out. I knew what I was going to say. It was going to take me 30 seconds, and the end of the program was nearing. So they took me out there, and I sat in the chair. And while I was sitting there, they gave me a microphone, but they also gave me this little earpiece. You see, in the auditorium, it's pretty loud, and it's hard to hear. You can't even hear yourself talk. So they had given me this little earpiece so I could hear the director upstairs talking to me in case there was something I needed to know. And that was important. I liked being able to hear the director upstairs. Well, the time was drawing near. I could see there was a timer right there that was counting down to my time. But something funny started to happen. I started to kind of hear the director's voice in my ear, but it was clear he was talking to somebody else, and there seemed to be an issue. There seemed to be a problem. And I looked at the camera, and I looked at the cameraman behind the camera, and it was clear he was also talking on his radio to the people upstairs. And I began to get nervous because there was obviously something wrong. And I thought, oh boy, well, hopefully this doesn't have too much to do with me. So I sat there wasn't anything I could really do, and I rehearsed my set in my head, and I was ready to go. Well, 15 to 20 seconds or so before I was supposed to be on, I finally heard the director's voice in my ear addressing me specifically. And I heard him up there, and he said, "Listen, Austin, there has been some issues with the countdown clock. We are really sorry about that there have been some mistakes made, some communication errors. But you're going to have to sit here and do a 3.5-minute spot." And then he started counting me down, 5, 4, 3, 2. And I sat there and I was terrified. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever had to make up 3.5 minutes of live, relevant TV material, that is hard. And that's what I had to do. And so I sat there, and I don't know how I made it. It nearly did me in, but I made it for that 3.5 minutes. The truth was, I would never have made it had it not been for the director constantly in my ear saying things like, well, talk about the speaker tomorrow. Give them the donation link. Talk about the concert this weekend. Tease this thing. Talk about that thing. I would have never made it through that segment had it not been for the voice upstairs. Sometimes we need some help, some assistance, someone to give us a hand. So today we are going to turn to a psalm, Psalm 121 to be exact, and we're going to talk about that idea a little bit. So I would like to invite you to turn there with me. Now, before we read this psalm, allow me to tell you a bit of the background which we're dealing with here. Most scholars agreed that we don't know for sure the author of this psalm, but it is likely King David. Now, again, we don't know that for sure, but he is probably the author. So we will function under that assumption that King David wrote this psalm. Now, again, we don't know that, and we also don't know the specific time in which it was written, but again, scholars have some good educated guesses. They think that this psalm was probably written by King David very nearly following the death of his friend, mentor, the prophet Samuel. So as you can understand, David has just lost someone in his life who was very important to him. He anointed David as king. And so David is here. He writes this psalm from a place of grief and from a place of sadness. And he is reaching out to the Lord saying, "Oh God, I need some help." So that is the context into which we step today. And so we're going to read this psalm. And there are 4 stanzas, and we're going to read each one. So we're going to begin with the first one. That is verses 1 and 2. So let's read together Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. The psalmist writes this: I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So immediately in this psalm, we see that David is asking for help, and he knows where his help comes from. He says, my help comes from God, the maker of heaven and earth. He's the one who helps me. He is the one who is with me. But what he says here may be a little more nuanced than we realize. A few years ago, our family had the opportunity to do a Holy Lands tour. And so we went out, and one of the things we visited was Petra, which is one of the major tourist attractions in the country of Jordan. Now, you may or may not know what that is, but if you don't, I would tell you that if you've ever seen the third Indiana Jones movie, there is a scene that features Petra pretty prominently. It's there in the desert. It is this incredible structures cut into the stone, into the rock. And so we went and visited. It was a lot of walking around, but we had a great time. Now, one of the things at Petra is the high places, the temples. And these are temples to pagan gods. And so you have to hike up a long, long way, and you come up to these high places, and there you can see altars where many, many years ago, hundreds, thousands of years ago, they would sacrifice. They would sacrifice even people and animals to their pagan gods. And those are the high places. Those are up on the tops of mountains. And so when David says what he says in this text, which we're going to look at one more time briefly, he says, I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Now, it's an interesting juxtaposition, because when David says he lifts his eyes up to the mountains, he is not talking about God. He's talking about these high places, these places where they would sacrifice to pagan gods. And he looks and he says, I lift my eyes up there, but I know where my help comes from. It's not from the pagan gods and from those altars or from those sacrifices. It is from the maker of heaven and earth. It is the Lord of Israel. It is the God of these people. That is where my help ultimately comes from. So David clearly understands where his help comes from. And there is a bit of foreshadowing. Although David may not himself know this, you know this. And that is that for years, decades, centuries, and generations, the Israelites will struggle with that. They will struggle with knowing where their help comes from. There are kings and leaders who will lead them down bad paths, and they will lead them astray into worshiping gods of other nations. And that is a spiritual struggle that for them must seem that it will last for an eternity. But David has the right answer here. He says, my help comes from the Lord. He is the maker of heaven and earth. So he knows exactly where to look for help. Now, for the next three stanzas, we're going to have some questions. David knows where his help comes from, but the first question we are going to deal with is, what is God going to do about that? When David asks for help, what's God going to do? And the answer to that question is, God says, I will protect. So let's read this second stanza and see how God says that he is going to protect David. Psalm 121, verses 3 and 4. Here's what the psalmist writes. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. So it is very clear here that God is saying, I will protect you. I will watch over you day and night. Even when you are asleep, I will not sleep. I will keep an eye out on you. I am here. I am your God. I will protect you. And that's what God says. Now, I came across this story in a book entitled Liberating Ministry from the Success Syndrome by Kent and Barbara Hughes. Now, in the spirit of guarding honesty, I must tell you that I have not read this book in its entirety, but this story caught me, and it is a good one to illustrate how God will protect each and every one of us. Here's what Kent and Barbara Hughes write. It was Christmas Eve, 1875, and Ira Sankey the well-known gospel singer of the late 1800s, was traveling on a Delaware River steamboat when he was recognized by some of the passengers. His picture had been in the newspaper because he was the song leader for the famous evangelist D.L. Moody. They asked him to sing one of his own hymns, but Sankey demurred, saying that he preferred to sing William Bradbury's hymn, Savior, Like a Shepherd Lead Us. As he sang, one of the stanzas began, "We are thine, do thou befriend us, be the guardian of our way." When he finished, a man stepped from the shadows and asked, "Did you ever serve in the Union Army?" "Yes," Mr. Sankey answered, "in the spring of 1860. "Can you remember if you were doing picket duty on a bright, moonlit night in 1862? "Yes," Mr. Sankey answered, very much surprised. "So did I. But I was serving in the Confederate Army. When I saw you standing at your post, I thought to myself, this fellow will never get away alive. I raised my musket and took aim. I was standing in the shadow, completely concealed. There was no way you could see me, while the full light of the moon was falling upon you. At that instant, just as a moment ago, you raised your eyes to heaven and began to sing. Let him sing his song to the end, I said to myself. I can shoot him afterwards. He's my victim at all events, and my bullet cannot miss him. But the song you sang then was the song you sang just now. I heard the words perfectly. We are thine, do thou befriend us, be the guardian of our way. Those words stirred up many memories. I began to think of my childhood and my God-fearing mother. She had many times sung that song to me. When you had finished your song, it was impossible for me to take aim again. I thought, the Lord who is able to save that man from certain death must surely be great and mighty. And my arm of its own accord dropped limp at my side. David knows where to look for help. He knows to look to the Lord, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. He knows that. And when he asks, God does not stay silent. God looks down upon him, and the first thing he says is, I will protect you. I will be with you. You have nothing to worry about. Even when you are facing certain death, I will stand there with you. It may not feel like it. You may not even see me or hear me or feel my presence. But do not be afraid, for I am there, says God. I will protect you. But then we have a third stanza and a second thing that God says here. In the second stanza, he has said, I will protect you. And then in this third stanza, he says, I will guide you. So let's read what it says. Psalm 121, verses 5 and 6. The psalmist writes this. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. So, if in the second stanza God said, I will protect you, in this third stanza God says, I will guide you. Even if you cannot see, nothing will harm you by day, nothing will harm you by night. I will guide your steps as you put one foot in front of the other. I will be there. A number of years ago, when my sister and I were kids, our family took a tour of Italy. And we stopped in Rome and the Vatican City. And we took a tour of what was going on there. And we stopped in front of St. Peter's Basilica. And it is the major cathedral and church there in Vatican City. Now, at that specific time, we didn't have a tour guide, but we were there and we were looking around. And as we were doing so, we noticed that there was another man guiding a tour around the basilica. And so we kind of tagged along. We got there with the rest of that group, and we watched him. Now, keep in mind, I was a child. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I remembered being absolutely captivated by the wealth of knowledge this man had. He described everything that had been built and the context and the time period. It was incredible. I was absolutely fascinated. And I remember thinking, wow, this is quite something. We went to every single corner of the basilica, and I learned a great deal. It was a wonderful experience. Well, we continued on our day and our time, and we came back the next day. But this time we had our whole tour group that we had been with for the other parts of the trip. And we came back to St. Peter's Basilica, and we had a scheduled tour of it. This time it was a different tour guide, and we took a tour of the same place where we had just been yesterday. We looked at a lot of the same things, and the tour guide talked about a lot of same places and stuff. But even in my young mind, as we did that, I remember thinking, this guy is the worst. He is not a good tour guide. He's not answering questions well. He's not giving the same amount of background and information. He just doesn't seem to know his stuff. Even in my young mind, I knew what it was like to be guided effectively and well, and I knew what it was like to have a poor guide who didn't know his stuff. I remember thinking, wow, what a difference. That is quite something. In this third stanza, God looks down upon David and says, I will guide you. Remember back in the first stanza, David cried out, and he knew where to cry out to. He cried out to God. And God, in his everlasting goodness and grace, looked back down upon David and said, 1, I will protect you. I will be there. And 2, I will guide you. I will guide your feet as you go throughout your life by day and by night. You need not worry. But here we have the fourth and final stanza. And God is going to say a third thing here back to David. And when we ask God what he is going to do in this last stanza, the third thing he's going to say is, I will bless you. I will be with you. So let's read it. Psalm 121, verses 7 and 8. The final stanza of this psalm. The psalmist writes, the Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. So he has said, I will protect you. He has said, I will guide you. And finally, he says, I will bless you. And the truth is, God goes above and beyond what he even needs to do. He says, I will bless you to David. Many, many years ago, there was a pianist in Hungary, and his name was Andar Foldes. And Foldes would come to be known as one of the greatest pianists of his generation, and probably ever. But it wasn't always that way for Foldes. Growing up, he had many difficult years. And when he was 16 years old and had had a particularly difficult year, there was another great pianist coming to Budapest, to Hungary, to hear him. And this particular person, Emil von Sauer, was the last surviving pupil of the great Franz Liszt. So he was ready. Foldes had a discography that included the great works from Beethoven and Mozart and Rachmaninoff and many of the others. Well, von Sauer came to town, and there was Foldes, ready to play. And so that's what he did. He played some of the most difficult pieces from some of these composers, from Beethoven and from Rachmaninoff and from some of the others. And when he was done, the great pianist, Emil von Sauer, approached him and kissed him on the forehead. And von Sauer said this to Foldes, my son, von Sauer said, when I was your age, I became a student of Liszt. He kissed me on the forehead after my first lesson, saying, "Take good care of this kiss. It comes from Beethoven, who gave it to me after hearing me play. I have waited for years to pass on this sacred heritage, but now I feel you deserve it." So God says three things. One, he says, "I will protect you." Two, he says, "I will guide you." And three, he says, "I will bless you." And so we think of this psalm, think of the writer, probably David, in a moment that has been undoubtedly very, very difficult. David has lost a friend, he's lost a mentor, the prophet Samuel, someone who has been there for the majority of his life and is there no longer. So David, in his grief, cries out to God. And he says, "Oh God, help me." And David knows where to cry out to. He looks to the mountains. He knows what's up there. He knows he can sacrifice to the pagan gods, and to the Baals, and to the Molechs, and to the gods of the surrounding nations. But he looks there and he says, "No, that is not the place to which I will call, because those gods will do nothing for me. Instead, I will call out to the God of Israel, the one who has always been here, who will come through. And that God will respond. And indeed he does. And he says, "I will protect you, even when you don't even know you need it. I will guide you. I will watch you take every step along the way. And finally, I will bless you," he says. "I will give you more than you could have ever imagined, more than you could even bargain for I am God." So today, as you go about your business, your life, your work, school, family, home, maybe you are at a moment where you are crying out. And you have a choice. There are many things to which you could cry out. We have technology. We have other addictions, substances, things we can watch. But are those the things we want to cry out to? Or will you choose to cry out to the Lord, the one who has said that he will protect you, the one who has said that he will guide you, and the one who has said that he will bless you? He is there waiting to hear you speak to him, because he is ready to impart his protection and guidance and blessings upon you. He is waiting. He is a God who will come through. And you can choose to cry out to the high places, to the pagan gods, to these other idols we have in our lives today. But God is ready. And he is there for you. We'd like to thank you so much for joining us today on Creating Disciples. Be blessed.